Well, sure. I'll start by, the best way to judge where we're at today is to understand where we came from. Back in the 1980s, we had a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, the United States led alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, confronting the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And the line of confrontation basically ran through Germany, West Germany, East Germany, both occupied at the end of the Second World War. And this was a very dangerous situation, especially in the early to mid 1980s when the Soviet Union and the United States began introducing what we call intermediate nuclear forces. These are missiles that have a range of say 500 to 5,000 miles. But what made them especially dangerous was, for instance, in the Soviet case, the SS-20 had 3 warheads, and they had hundreds of these missiles. So if there was going to be a war in Europe, every single major European city would be destroyed. I just want to say that one more time so it sinks in. Every single major European city in Europe will be destroyed if there was a war. The United States responded by deploying its own missiles, a cruise missile, Tomahawk, and then the ground launch cruise missile, and then the Pershing II. The thing about the Pershing II is that once it was launched from its base in Germany, it could hit Moscow in 7 to 10 minutes, meaning that there's no time for anybody to make a decision, no time to think. If a launch was detected, you're going to hit the button and fire everything, which means not just every single major city in Europe, but every single major city in the United States would have been evaporated within 45 minutes. The world ends. This wasn't a joke, ladies and gentlemen. This was real. We lived it 24/7. I was raised in Germany. We lived in a German village next to a nuclear weapons depot. If there was a war, that would be one of the first targets hit. So every morning as a child, I woke up wondering if I was going to get the 200,000 degree suntan, which is basically what happens when a nuclear bomb goes off and the heat flash hits you. That's the reality we lived in. The United States and the Soviet Union, or what we call Russia today, on the cusp of a war that could terminate life as we know it in the world. Now, the Cold War ended. It didn't just end on its own. One of the things I did as a Marine was not only trained to kill the Soviets, I was pretty proficient in what we call combined arms warfare, maneuver warfare, but I also was the first inspector sent to the Soviet Union in 1988 to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that got rid of those missiles I was telling you about. So there was a recognition on the part of the United States and the Soviet Union that these missiles represented an existential threat to the survival of the world, and they agreed to get rid of them. We did this. And because of that, we developed this trust that led to a reduction of tension. And then the Soviet Union fell, the Warsaw Pact went away, and one would have thought that this was a perfect opportunity for a framework of peace to break out all over Europe. But the United States and the Europeans decided to keep NATO in place. And NATO transformed into something that it wasn't originally envisioned to be. It was originally envisioned to be a defensive organization, a defensive alliance, and then became an alliance that now had European security as its mission, and that included offensive military action. We saw that in 1999 against the Serbs. We saw that in 2011 against the Libyans, and on and on and on. So the situation we find ourselves in today is, instead of the world being a safer place after going through this horrific period of time in the 1980s, it's like we've gone back in time. It's like a Michael J. Fox movie. We got in our DeLorean and we went too fast and poof, we're back in time. Because once again, we have NATO facing off against a Russian military capability. And now the United States, having withdrawn from the INF Treaty in 2019, is talking about sending intermediate nuclear missiles back to Europe to recreate the exact same situation that we got rid of in the 1980s. And now what's worse is that in the Cold War, it was called a Cold War because we never really got into a shooting match. Today we have a hot war. Today we have an actual large-scale ground combat going on in the largest European country, Ukraine. And it's a war that has already invoked the specter of nuclear weapons, with Russia saying that if NATO interferes, that represents an existential threat, and Russia may have to use nuclear weapons in response. So now NATO, for the first time, is talking about what its nuclear strike policy is. So we have two sides actively preparing for nuclear war as we speak. Ladies and gentlemen, the stakes couldn't get any higher than this. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? Did Russia wake up one morning and say, I want to invade Ukraine? I just want to destabilize the world and go for it. Or has Russia been reacting to the failure of NATO to dissolve itself at the end of the Cold War and instead expand itself eastward in a manner that Russia viewed as a threat? And this isn't a threat that Russia only recently talked about. We know that Russia has raised the expansion of NATO continuously since the 1990s. The National Security Archives has the audio tapes of the phone calls from President Clinton and then President Yeltsin, where Yeltsin is begging Clinton not to expand NATO. This puts me in a bad light, he said. This is an embarrassment. I lose face with my people. And Clinton said, sorry, we're expanding NATO anyways. Vladimir Putin, when he became president, said, hey, rather than just expanding NATO, why don't you invite me in? And that way we don't have to worry about it. We'll make it one big happy club. And the United States wouldn't do it, because NATO's purpose was to contain Russia, not absorb Russia. This expansion of NATO has been viewed by Russia as a threat. We know this. In 2007, Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, gave an outstanding speech, one of the best examples of modern political rhetoric anywhere. I advise everybody to go and watch it. It is a brilliant speech, and he articulates forcefully and eloquently the Russian position. No one can say we don't know what the Russian position was. There it is, spoken by the president himself. One of the things he said is that this expansion of NATO represents an existential threat. It's a red line. How do we know this? William Burns, you might know that name right now. He's currently the director of the CIA. At the time, in 2008, he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He wrote a memorandum called "Niet" means niet, no means no, articulating what the Russian position was in regards to NATO expansion. He said it's a red line and the Russians mean it. They view this as an existential threat. If you continue to expand NATO, and here's the important thing, and he wrote this in February 2009, if you continue to push for the expansion of NATO, Russia will have no choice but to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose at a minimum the Crimea and the Donbass. He predicted the future. Maybe that's why he's the director of the CIA today, but he predicted the future accurately. No one can say we didn't know. We knew, and yet we continued to do this. And we pushed Russia into a corner until last December. They said enough is enough. They sent 2 draft treaties demanding a restructuring of the European security framework, and they demand that Ukraine opt out of NATO, become neutral. They said, we're not joking. Take this seriously. If you don't take this seriously, we will have no choice but to undertake what they call the military technical option. They weren't taken seriously. The United States and Europe ignored them, belittled them, mocked them. And now we have what we have, because the Russians don't bluff. That's lesson number 1 out of this whole thing, is the Russians don't bluff.